Is anyone free from suffering? Hello, and welcome back to the Dharma Insights Teachings channel. On our journey exploring Buddhist wisdom, we've learned about the Buddha, the Awakened One, and the essence of Buddhism, a way of life that brings inner peace. Today, we're going to touch upon a topic that perhaps each of us has experienced, and at times, it causes us a great deal of distress: suffering. Are you feeling tired, anxious, or disappointed? Have there been times when you've wondered why life is so difficult, and why it seems everyone has to go through some form of suffering, whether big or small? From the pressures of work, conflicts within the family, to the sorrow of separation, illness, or simply the feeling of emptiness despite having everything. Is suffering perhaps an inevitable part of life? And have you ever thought that perhaps because you don't truly understand what suffering is or why you suffer, you remain trapped in a vicious cycle of insecurity and exhaustion? If you nod in agreement to these questions, then this video is for you. Today, we won't talk about suffering to make you pessimistic, but rather to look directly at it together, to understand its nature from a Buddhist perspective. Because truly understanding suffering is the first, most powerful step you can take to begin your journey of transformation, finding peace and equanimity in your life. Let's begin.
1. What is suffering in Buddhism, beyond the ordinary definition, touching your core issues? When we speak of suffering, most of us immediately think of clear, obvious pain, like physical illness, accidents, or the loss of a loved one. But in Buddhism, the concept of suffering, in Pali, Dukkha, goes much deeper. It's not just surface-level pain, but also dissatisfaction, discontent, imperfection, or the unstable nature of all phenomena. In other words, it's the state of not being as we wish, not being satisfactory. The Buddha pointed out 3 main types of suffering, and you'll find them very relatable to what you experience every day. Dukkha, dukkha, suffering of suffering, the obvious pains everyone recognizes. This is the most easily recognizable type of suffering, encompassing clear physical and mental pain. Examples: you're sick, have a toothache, or are enduring a chronic illness. That's physical dukkha dukkha. You fail at work, argue with loved ones, or feel lonely and lost. That's mental dukkha dukkha. Who among us hasn't experienced the pressure of work deadlines, sleepless nights worrying about the future, or the sorrow of witnessing loved ones grow old and ill? These are the sufferings we often try to avoid, but they are always present in life. Viparinama dukkha, suffering of change, the suffering that arises from the alteration and disappearance of temporary joys. This is a more subtle type of suffering, harder to recognize. It's not pain itself, but the feeling of emptiness or disappointment when joys and happiness that seemed everlasting disappear. Examples: you just bought a brand new phone and felt immense joy, but then, a few weeks later, that excitement vanishes. You feel ordinary again, perhaps even wanting something newer. Or you've just achieved a major career success and joy overflows. But can you hold on to that feeling forever? No. That joy will fade, and you'll start searching for a new goal, a new joy. Viparinama dukkha is the truth that all the happiness we cling to is impermanent, and when it changes or is lost, we experience suffering. Sankhara dukkha, the latent suffering of existence, the hardest to recognize. This is the deepest level of suffering and also the most difficult to perceive, yet it is the root cause. Sankhara dukkha is the inherent unsatisfactoriness, the incompleteness of all conditioned phenomena, meaning everything arises from causes and conditions, is constantly changing, and nothing is permanent or perfectly satisfactory. Examples: you have everything, a successful career, a happy family, good health. But sometimes you still feel a vague anxiety, a sense of incompleteness, or a slight discomfort when things don't go exactly your way, even for the smallest matters. That is sankhara dukkha, the latent suffering arising from the impermanent nature of life and our clinging to things that cannot last.
2. Why do we suffer? Discovering the root cause and finding where to begin change.
Having understood what suffering is, the next question is, why do we suffer? The Buddha pointed out the core causes of all suffering within the Four Noble Truths, which we call samudaya, the origin of suffering. The root of suffering lies within our own minds, specifically in three factors: greed, attachment, aversion, or hatred, and delusion, or ignorance. Greed, attachment, lobha, or tam. This is the endless craving and clinging. This is the insatiable craving, the clinging to material possessions, fame, feelings, or even our own opinions. Examples: you want more money, a better job, a bigger house. There's nothing wrong with having these desires, but the problem lies in clinging to them. When you intensely crave and cling to the idea that you must achieve these things, you become immensely anxious when they haven't arrived, or deeply unhappy when they don't materialize. You want recognition, praise, and you suffer when criticized. You want the feeling of happiness to last forever, but you suffer when the joy passes. This very clinging creates fear and anxiety, making you always feel incomplete and lacking. Aversion, or hatred, dosa, or san. This is the unpleasant reaction, anger when things don't go as desired. This is anger, annoyance, resentment, or even disappointment when faced with something you dislike or when things don't unfold as you wished. Examples: you get angry when stuck in traffic, irritated when unfairly criticized, resentful when plans fall through, or annoyed with someone who doesn't perform as you expect. Aversion not only harms others, but also burns your own inner peace. Perhaps you've experienced that feeling. The more angry you get, the more tired and miserable you feel, right? Delusion, or ignorance, moha, or si. Lack of understanding of the true nature of phenomena. This is the deepest and most dangerous factor. Delusion is the incorrect perception of the impermanent, non-self nature of all things and the law of cause and effect, karma. We believe that happiness is permanent, that everything we have truly belongs to us, or that there is a fixed, unchanging self. Examples: we are deluded when we believe in eternal happiness within a relationship, a job, or a material possession. When that belief shatters, we suffer. We are deluded when we fail to recognize that every action, good or bad, has consequences, karma, and we continue to create unwholesome actions, leading to future suffering. This very ignorance is the foundation for the arising of greed and aversion. The Buddha taught that suffering is not a punishment you must endure, but a natural consequence of how we perceive and react to life, stemming from our own mental states of greed, aversion, and delusion. Suffering lies in how we cling, react, and misunderstand the world.
3. Understanding suffering to begin to change, hope, and the path to freedom ahead. So, what does it mean for you to truly understand suffering? It's not meant to make you more depressed or pessimistic. On the contrary, it empowers you with a tremendous force, the power of awareness. Just as a doctor must correctly diagnose a disease to prescribe effective medicine, recognizing and understanding the nature of suffering is the first, most crucial step for you to begin the process of healing and transformation. When you understand that suffering is a reality and that its causes lie within your own mind, you no longer feel like a victim of circumstances. Instead, you realize you have the ability to change. Buddhism doesn't just talk about suffering. It also points out that suffering can cease, nirodha, and that there is a path to the cessation of suffering, magga. That is precisely the light of hope we need. The journey of change begins with very simple steps: accepting reality, acknowledging that suffering is a part of life instead of trying to avoid or deny it. When you accept, you free up a significant amount of energy that was previously used to resist it. Observing your mind. Begin to take time to notice the emotions and thoughts that cause suffering without judgment. When you're angry, try to acknowledge, I'm feeling angry. When you're anxious, recognize, I'm feeling anxious. This is the beginning of mindfulness, which we discussed. Observing helps you create a distance from your emotions, so you're not carried away by them. Reducing clinging. Practice letting go of unrealistic desires and unsustainable expectations. When you cling less to outcomes, you will feel much lighter and freer. Remember, Buddhist teachings are not a magic pill that cures all ailments, but a method, a path for you to walk yourself, to experience for yourself, and to attain inner peace for yourself. And the first step on that journey is to clearly understand what suffering is, why it exists, and from there, you will gain the wisdom and courage to begin to change your life.
So, suffering is an unavoidable part of life, but when we clearly understand its nature and its deep-seated causes, we gain immense power to confront and transform it. The most important message today is, you can change the way you experience life. After this video, do you have a different perspective on the sufferings you are experiencing? Which suffering in your life troubles you the most, and how do you want to start observing it? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I would love to hear your story. If you found this video helpful and want to continue your journey of exploring the path to freedom from suffering, especially how we will see suffering and walk the path to the cessation of suffering in our next videos, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Dharma Insights Teachings channel so you don't miss out on valuable content. Thank you for accompanying me. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.